Hello, everyone, and welcome to America Daily Update. Let's take a look at what's happening across the country right now. If you look at a map of Eastern Europe today, really look at it. Stripped of the propaganda and the moralizing rhetoric of the Western press, you see a tragedy that was entirely predictable. We are standing on the precipice of the final act in Ukraine, a strategic checkmate that has been visible on the horizon for months, if not years, to anyone willing to see the world as it actually is, rather than how they wish it to be. The focus of this impending catastrophe, the point where the hammer will finally fall, is Odessa. For the better part of 2 years, the narrative managers in Washington and London have tried to convince you that this conflict is a stalemate, or even a slow, grinding victory for the NATO-backed forces. They speak of counter-offensives and wonder weapons, of Abrams tanks and F-16 seconds, as if war is a video game where the right cheat code can reverse the fundamental realities of geography and demographics. But while the cameras were focused on the mud of the Donbass, the real strategic existential threat has always been to the south. We are witnessing the unfolding of a scenario that terrified strategic planners for generations, a scenario that spells not just the defeat of the current government in Kiev, but the absolute disintegration of Ukraine as a viable, functional state. We are watching the creation of a landlocked rump state, a broken fragment of a nation cut off from the sea, dependent entirely on Western charity for its survival. And this realization, this cold, hard dawn of reality, is finally starting to induce panic in the back rooms of the Pentagon in Brussels. They know that without Odessa, the war is effectively over. They know that if Russia controls the entire Black Sea coast, the project to weaken Moscow has not only failed, but backfired in the most catastrophic way imaginable. To understand why this is happening and why it was inevitable, we have to step back from the daily headlines and look at the grand sweep of history. We have to look at this through the lens of realism. Great powers behave in predictable ways. They are driven by the imperative of survival and the domination of their immediate periphery. This is not about good versus evil or democracy versus autocracy. Despite what the State Department spokespeople regurgitate from their podiums, this is about security architecture and the immutable laws of power. For centuries, the Russian grand strategy has been obsessed with one thing above all else: access to warm water ports. From Peter the Great to Catherine the Great, the drive to the Black Sea was not an imperial vanity project. It was a matter of economic and military life or death. Odessa is not just a city. It is the pearl of the Black Sea, the economic lung through which the vast agricultural and industrial wealth of the steppe flows to the world. It is a city built by Russian empresses and defended by Soviet blood. The idea that Moscow would ever allow this critical artery to become a NATO naval base, hosting American destroyers and nuclear-capable missiles, is a delusion so profound it borders on clinical insanity. Yet, this is exactly the delusion that the West has peddled. We poked the bear. We expanded our military alliance right up to its porch, and now we feign shock that the bear has decided to tear down the fence and secure the yard. Let us be brutally honest about the hypocrisy that underpins the entire Western position here. We need to talk about the Monroe Doctrine. In the United States, we are taught that it is our God-given right to exclude any foreign great power from the Western Hemisphere. When the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba in 1962, we didn't file a complaint with the United Nations. We didn't impose sanctions. We blockaded the island and threatened nuclear war. We were ready to incinerate the world to prevent a rival military alliance from setting up shop in our backyard. This is the behavior of a regional hegemon. It is standard operating procedure for a great power. Yet, when Russia applies the exact same logic to Ukraine, to a border that is far more historically and strategically sensitive to them than Cuba is to us, we call it unprovoked aggression. We call it imperialism. This double standard is not just a moral failing, it is a strategic blindness. The United States has spent the last 30 years intoxicated by its own unipolar moment, believing that the laws of history no longer applied to us. We believed we could go anywhere, topple any regime, expand any alliance, and never face consequences. We thought we had reached the end of history, but history has returned with a vengeance. The seizure of Odessa will mark the definitive end of that American illusion. It is the moment when the irresistible force of NATO expansion meets the immovable object of Russian existential resolve. The tragedy is that none of this had to happen. There was a time when a neutral Ukraine acting as a bridge between East and West was a viable possibility. But the hubris of the Washington establishment could not abide neutrality. They wanted total submission. They wanted the map painted entirely in NATO blue. And in their pursuit of this maximalist goal, they have doomed the very nation they claim to be saving. By refusing to negotiate, by refusing to acknowledge Russia's legitimate security concerns regarding the Black Sea, the West has forced Moscow's hand. Russia initially appeared content with the liberation of the Donbass and the security of Crimea. But as the West escalated, supplying longer-range missiles and targeting the Black Sea Fleet, the calculus in the Kremlin changed. They realized that they cannot leave a hostile NATO-armed entity in control of the coast. They realized that as long as Odessa remains in Ukrainian hands, it will be used as a dagger pointed at the soft underbelly of Russia. Therefore, the logic of war dictates that Odessa must fall. This is the grim reality of the security dilemma. Our attempt to make Ukraine more secure by flooding it with weapons has made it infinitely less secure to the point where its very existence as a maritime nation is about to be extinguished. This upcoming offensive, this final push for the coast, exposes the limits of American power in a way that no other event in the 21st century has done. We are seeing the twilight of American hegemony. Not because we lack aircraft carriers or dollars, but because we have lost the ability to shape outcomes. We threw the entire financial weight of the G7 against the Russian economy, predicting a collapse within weeks. It didn't happen. We emptied our stockpiles of artillery and ammunition, stripping our own defenses bare to fuel this proxy war. It wasn't enough. And now, as the Russian military machine grinds forward methodically and ruthlessly, we are left watching from the sidelines, impotent. The fall of Odessa will be the Suez moment for the United States, a stark, undeniable signal to the world that the old order is dead. The global South is watching. Beijing is watching. Tehran is watching. They see that the emperor has no clothes, or at least that his armor is cracked and his sword is dull. They see that for all our talk of a rules-based international order, the only rule that matters is power, and the United States no longer holds a monopoly on it. We are entering a new era, a harsh and unforgiving era of multipolarity where the illusions of liberal internationalism go to die in the trenches of Eastern Europe. The loss of access to the sea is a death sentence for a nation's economy, and by steering Ukraine into this abyss, the West has effectively signed its death warrant while patting itself on the back for its moral superiority. The architects of this war in Washington committed a cardinal sin of strategy. They believed their own propaganda. They operated under the arrogant assumption that the United States controls the central nervous system of the global economy, and that any nation, no matter how large or resource-rich, could be brought to its knees simply by flipping a switch in the Treasury Department. This was the logic behind the shock and a sanctions campaign launched in the early days of the conflict. It was supposed to be an economic nuclear strike. We froze their central bank assets. We cut them off from SWIFT. We ousted their oligarchs, and we threatened secondary sanctions on anyone who dared to trade with Moscow. The prediction from the smartest guys in the room, the Ivy League technocrats, and the think tank experts was a collapse of the ruble, hyperinflation, and a contraction of the Russian GDP by 20% or more. They expected bread riots in St. Petersburg and a palace coup in the Kremlin. But look at the reality today. The ruble stabilized. The Russian economy is growing faster than the economies of Germany or the United Kingdom. The supermarkets in Moscow are full. The lights are on. The factories are humming. And the war machine is churning out shells at a rate that the combined industrial capacity of NATO cannot match. This is not just a failure of policy. It is a systemic failure of the Western coercive mechanism. It is the moment the world realized that the US dollar is no longer the omnipotent weapon we thought it was. What we failed to understand is the fundamental difference between the financialized service-based economies of the West and the physical commodity-based economy of Russia. You cannot print food. You cannot print oil. You cannot print palladium or neon gas. Russia sits on the largest stockpile of natural resources on the planet. To think that you can isolate a country that provides the world with its heat, its bread, and the raw materials for its technology is the height of delusion. We sanctioned ourselves. We severed the cheap energy arteries that kept European industry competitive, driving German manufacturing into the ground, while Russia simply pivoted east and south. This is the great circumvention. The West likes to pretend it is the world, but the global South, the global majority, refused to join this suicide pact. China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey looked at the sanctions and saw an opportunity not a moral obligation. They saw cheap oil, cheap gas, and a partner willing to trade outside the hegemonic structures of the West. We created a shadow fleet of oil tankers almost overnight, a vast armada moving Russian crude to Indian refineries where it is processed and sold back to Europe at a markup. It is a theater of the absurd. We are still buying Russian energy. We are just paying middlemen to wash the paperwork, allowing us to maintain our moral posturing while our economies slowly bleed out. This circumvention goes beyond just oil. It strikes at the heart of American financial supremacy. By weaponizing the dollar, by seizing sovereign assets, we sent a terrifying signal to every capital from Beijing to Riyadh. We told them that their money is not safe if they cross Washington. We told them that the dollar is not a neutral reserve currency but a political leash. And so we accelerated the very thing we feared most, dollarization. We are seeing the birth of a parallel financial system. Bilateral trade in local currencies has exploded. The yuan is replacing the dollar and the euro and Russian trade. BRICS has transformed from a loose acronym into a formidable economic bloc that controls more of the world's GDP and purchasing power parity terms than the G7. We pushed Russia into the arms of China, cementing a strategic partnership that combines Russian resources with Chinese industrial capacity. This is the geopolitical nightmare that Henry Kissinger warned against, and the Biden administration has walked right into it with its eyes wide shut. We have incentivized the creation of an alternative global architecture that is immune to our sanctions. The SWIFT system, once the ultimate lever of power, is being bypassed by SIPs and SPFS. We have played our ace card and it didn't win the hand. Now everyone knows the bluff. Consider the technological aspect of this failure. The narrative was that without Western semiconductors, without American software and German machine tools, the Russian military-industrial complex would grind to a halt. We were told they were stripping washing machines for chips. It was a comforting story, a fairy tale for the MSNBC crowd. But war is the ultimate auditor. On the battlefield, Russian electronic warfare systems are blinding our smartest weapons. Their hypersonic missiles are penetrating our vaunted air defense shields. Their production of drones and artillery has scaled up exponentially. While Western factories struggled to source gunpowder, it turns out that Russia had been preparing for this decoupling for years. They had built resilience into their supply chains. They utilized gray market imports. Through Central Asia and the Caucasus, a truck crosses the border from Turkey to Georgia to Russia, carrying the very tech we banned, and there is nothing we can do to stop it without sanctioning half the world. The blockade is leaky because the world is too interconnected and the profit motive is too strong. The arsenal of democracy is finding itself outproduced by a nation it dismissed as a gas station with nukes. The panic in Washington is now palpable. You can smell it in the desperation of their rhetoric. They realize they are in a trap of their own making. If they double down on sanctions, they risk fracturing the global economy further and alienating the global South even more. If they back down, they admit defeat and the end of American primacy. They are watching the Russian army prepare for the siege of Odessa, knowing that the economic war has failed to stop the tanks. The sanctions were supposed to degrade the Russian war machine. Instead, they battle-hardened it. They forced Russia to become eutaric, self-sufficient, and lean. We pruned the dead wood from their economy and left them stronger. Meanwhile, the blowback is tearing through Western societies. Inflation, energy costs, and the deindustrialization of Europe are the direct costs of this failed policy. We are sacrificing the prosperity of our own citizens on the altar of a geopolitical gamble that has already been lost. The checkmate in Ukraine is not just military. It is the total collapse of the West's ability to coerce its rivals through economic pain. The mechanism is broken. The empire has no close. And as the Russian tricolor prepares to rise over the Black Sea coast, the world is taking notes. The age of financial terror is ending, and the age of hard power, of resources, and industrial capacity has returned. But the strategic incompetence displayed by the Western alliance is dwarfed only by its grotesque moral hypocrisy. We are constantly bombarded with high-minded rhetoric about values, democracy, and the sacred obligation to defend sovereignty. The political class in Washington loves to drape itself in the flag of virtue, presenting every foreign intervention as a crusade of light against darkness. But let us strip away the sanctimonious veneer and look at the actual track record of this so-called benevolent hegemony. The United States does not liberate nations. It consumes them. It uses them as battering rams against its geopolitical rivals, grinds them into dust, and then abandons the wreckage to rot. We lure vulnerable states into our orbit with promises of protection and prosperity, seducing them into taking hardline stances they cannot afford to maintain, only to leave them high and dry when the bill comes due. Ukraine is not a partner in the eyes of the American establishment. It is a tool, a blunt instrument to be used against Russia until it breaks, at which point it will be discarded like a used artillery casing. We have seen this script play out time and time again in the last 2 decades. Look at the graveyard of nations saved by American intervention. We went into Iraq promising freedom and democracy. We demonized a dictator, mobilized the world through lies about weapons of mass destruction, and shattered the Iraqi state. The result was not a Jeffersonian democracy on the Euphrates, it was a sectarian carol house, 1 million dead civilians, the rise of ISIS, and a broken country that is now, ironically, a client state of Iran. We looked at Libya, the most prosperous nation in Africa, a country with the highest standard of living on the continent, and we decided that Gaddafi had to go. We invoked the doctrine of responsibility to protect. We bombed their infrastructure and armed tribal militias. And what is Libya today? It is a failed state, a lawless wasteland ruled by warlords where human beings are literally sold in open slave markets. This is the legacy of our moral leadership. We turned a functioning state into a hellscape, and then we walked away, washing our hands of the blood while the cameras moved on to the next crisis. Syria offers perhaps the most cynical example of all. In our obsession with toppling Assad and severing the link between Damascus and throne, we poured billions of dollars of weapons into the hands of jihadists. We branded them moderate rebels, a term so Orwellian it would be laughable if the consequences weren't so horrific. We fueled a civil war that displaced millions and destroyed ancient cities, prolonging the suffering for years in a futile attempt to achieve regime change. We didn't care about the Syrian people. We cared about the pipeline maps and the balance of power in the Levant, and now we are doing the exact same thing to Ukraine. We encouraged Kyiv to abandon neutrality. We encouraged them to tear up the Minsk agreements, which could have secured peace and reintegrated the Donbass. We whispered in their ears that NATO had their back, that they should fight to the last man, and they are fighting to the last man. We have turned Ukraine into a zombie state, kept alive only by massive infusions of Western cash and equipment, while a generation of its men are slaughtered in the mud. This is the moral trap of the American empire. We frame our geopolitical ambition as a moral imperative, making compromise impossible. You cannot negotiate with evil, so you must fight until total victory, even if total victory is a fantasy. By casting this conflict as a holy war between democracy and autocracy, the West trapped itself in a corner where it cannot de-escalate without losing face. And the victims of this rigidity are the Ukrainians themselves. The loss of Odessa will be the ultimate monument to this betrayal. By refusing to acknowledge Russia's existential red lines, by pushing for a maximalist victory that was never achievable, we have ensured the partition of Ukraine. We have guaranteed that it will lose its access to the sea, its economic independence, and its future. We are watching the dismantling of a nation orchestrated by friends in Washington who are safely thousands of miles away from the craters and the coffins. The cynicism is breathtaking. When the dust settles and Odessa flies the Russian flag, the Western narrative managers will eventually pivot. They will blame the Ukrainians for corruption or poor tactics or a lack of will. They will rewrite history to absolve themselves of responsibility. But the truth is written in the blood of the fallen. The United States has weaponized the concept of democracy to serve the interests of the military-industrial complex and the globalist elite. We claim to be upholding the rule of law, yet we steal sovereign assets and blow up pipelines. We claim to champion human rights, yet we sanction medicine and food supplies, starving civilians to punish their governments. It is a predatory foreign policy disguised as philanthropy. The global South sees this. They remember the coups in Latin America, the assassinations in Africa, the invasions in the Middle East. They know that when an American diplomat arrives talking about reform and partnership, it is usually the prelude to a looting operation. The fall of Odessa is the karmic bill coming due. It is the proof that you cannot build a stable world order on a foundation of lies and coercion. The tragedy is that the American people, by and large, are good people who believe in the ideals their government espouses. They do not want to be the architects of chaos. but the ruling class in Washington has hijacked those ideals, twisting them into a justification for endless war and domination. They have sacrificed the stability of Europe and the lives of hundreds of thousands of Eastern Europeans to weaken a geopolitical rival, and they have failed. Russia is not weakened. It is mobilized and angry. Ukraine is not saved. It is being erased. This is not the result of a mistake. It is the result of a system that values hegemony over humanity, a system that views nations as pawns on a chessboard rather than homes for real people. As the Russian pincers close around the Black Sea coast, we are witnessing the moral bankruptcy of the West laid bare for all the world to see. This is not just a localized conflict over a port city. It is the catalyst for a global reckoning that is reshaping the very nature of warfare and international relations. As the Russian flag moves closer to Odessa, we are witnessing the terrifying crystallization of a new axis of power, a counter-hegemonic bloc that the United States inadvertently forged through its own strategic myopia. By declaring economic and proxy war on Russia, we force them to unlock the ultimate geopolitical nightmare, the full unbridled integration of Russian resources with Chinese industry and Iranian asymmetric capabilities. We have created a monster. We pushed Moscow, Beijing, Throne, and Pyongyang into a unified trench. They are no longer just trading partners. They are brothers in arms sharing intelligence, technology, and strategic depth in a way that NATO cannot effectively counter. This is reciprocal escalation on a grand scale. We thought we could bleed Russia and Ukraine without consequence, but the blowback has arrived and it is hitting us everywhere at once. Consider the asymmetry of this new global conflict. The United States is obsessed with kinetic power, aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, and expensive missile systems. We measure power in tonnage and firepower. But our adversaries are fighting a different kind of war. They are fighting a war of systems, supply chains, and leverage. While we were busy sending tanks to the Donbass, China restricted the export of gallium and germanium, critical minerals essential for the production of semiconductors and advanced military radar. This was a warning shot, a subtle reminder that the inputs for our high-tech war machine are controlled by the very rival we are trying to contain. Russia, in turn, has weaponized food and energy, holding the global inflation rate hostage. This is asymmetric warfare in its purest form. We threaten them with financial ruin. They threaten us with the physical collapse of our industrial base and the starvation of our allies in the global south. We are playing checkers with missiles while they are playing 4D chess with a periodic table of elements. The fallout is spreading well beyond the Black Sea. Look at the chaos erupting in the Middle East. Do you think it is a coincidence that as the U.S. bogged itself down in Ukraine, the deterrence architecture in the region collapsed? The enemies of the West smell blood. They see an empire that is overstretched, distracted, and depleting its stockpiles at an unsustainable rate. The crisis in the Red Sea, where a ragtag militia has effectively blockaded one of the world's most vital shipping lanes, is a direct symptom of this weakness. We are firing $2 million interceptor missiles to shoot down $2,000 drones. The math doesn't work. We are being bled dry financially and militarily in a war of attrition that spans multiple continents. Russia's playing this game masterfully by deepening ties with Iran and North Korea. They are creating pressure points for the U.S. across the globe. They are signaling that if we escalate in Ukraine, they can escalate in Syria, in the Persian Gulf, or on the Korean Peninsula. They have the capacity to light fires everywhere, forcing the U.S. to run around like a panicked firefighter until the water runs out. And make no mistake, the water is running out. The arsenal of democracy is empty. The war in Ukraine has exposed the shocking brittle leanness of the Western defense industrial base. We have transferred so much equipment to Kiev, thousands of Stingers, javelins, and artillery rounds that our own stockpiles are dangerously low. Military planners are quietly admitting that if a conflict were to break out in the Pacific tomorrow, we would run out of precision-guided munitions within a week. We have hollowed out our own national security to sustain a proxy war that is unwinnable. We stripped our forces to defend a border in Eastern Europe while leaving our own borders wide open and our strategic interests in Asia vulnerable. This is the definition of strategic insanity. We have prioritized the defense of Odessa, a city that will fall regardless over the defense of Taiwan or the security of the American homeland. This geopolitical tension is not just an abstract concept discussed in war colleges. It is coming for your bank account. The economic blowback of this confrontation is structural and long-term. The era of cheap goods and stable prices was built on the foundation of cheap Russian energy and efficient Chinese manufacturing, lubricated by the US dollar. That era is dead. We killed it. By fragmenting the global economy into rival blocs, we have baked inflation into the system. The supply chain disruptions, the energy volatility, the rising cost of insurance for shipping, all of this translates into higher prices for everything from gas to groceries. The standard of living in the West is dropping, and it is going to keep dropping. We are paying the empire tax. We are paying for the hubris of our leaders who thought they could sanction the world without consequences. The instability we fanned abroad has come home to roost. Furthermore, the diplomatic isolation of the West is growing. We look at the UN votes and tell ourselves that the world is with us. But look closer. Thank you for being part of our news community. I'll catch you in the next video with fresh updates from across America.